Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently guide you through the veils of time, to a place where the clocks are silent, the candles flicker softly, and the air is thick with the scent of old stone, moss, and wood smoke. A place where the world is not what we know today, but something slower, simpler, and perhaps stranger. So take a deep breath, settle into the stillness around you, pull the blanket just a little tighter, and let your eyes grow heavy if they must. Because our journey begins now. This is the story of a person, perhaps not so different from yourself, who closed their eyes in one world and opened them in another. Not another country, not another city, but another century. A time of knights and castles, of whispered secrets and creaking wooden carts, of forests that held more than animals and towns that whispered at dusk. Let us begin. It started with a storm that seemed to rattle the windows of your apartment more violently than usual. You had fallen asleep reading, as you often did, a book resting gently against your chest, the last sentence half finished in your mind. The rain tapped like fingers on glass, and thunder murmured low and long through the distance. Somewhere between sleep and waking, the world turned itself inside out. The first thing you noticed was not sight, but sound. Birds, not the shrill, hurried city birds you were used to, but deep-throated, ancient-sounding calls echoing through thick woods. Then the rustling of leaves above you, not the scattered rustle of trees in a park, but a full living canopy, vast, endless, breathing with the wind. You opened your eyes. The sky above was overcast but bright, a soft grey lit by the early morning. Trees loomed around you, tall and proud, their trunks gnarled with age, roots curling from the ground like knuckles. You lay on a bed of damp moss and fallen leaves, your clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, now streaked with earth. It didn't feel like a dream, not in the usual way. There was a sharp clarity to everything, the cold in the air, the richness of the smells, even the distant crackle of something burning, wood perhaps? You stood slowly, feeling every joint in your body complain. The book was gone, and then came the next sound, hooves, clopping, steady, rhythmic hooves. Through the trees, not far off, came the figure of a man on horseback. Not just a man, but one dressed in something like rough brown wool, with a cloak slung over his shoulder, and boots made not by machines but by hand, worn from use. He carried no phone, no watch, only a small satchel, and on his side a dagger. The horse spotted you first. It stopped, head high. The man followed suit. You stood frozen. He looked at you for a long moment, not fearful, but puzzled. His brow furrowed as he took in your appearance, the strange fabrics, the cut of your clothes, your shoes, your hair. Then, in accented English, rough but understandable, he asked, "Are you lost, friend?" You tried to speak, but your throat was dry. You managed a nod. He studied you again, eyes narrowing slightly, but not unkindly. Then he dismounted, his movements careful, deliberate. The saddle creaked. He stepped forward and offered a small piece of bread from his satchel. "Eat. You look pale." You hesitated, but hunger won. The bread was coarse, grainy, and a little stale, but it filled a hollow space you hadn't realised had grown in your stomach. As you ate, he watched. "Strange garments," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "Where am I?" you finally managed to ask. His eyebrows rose. "Why, in Ashcombe, of course, 3 miles south of the old abbey, near the woods of Withersmere." None of the names meant anything. You shook your head. "What year is it?" He paused then, clearly puzzled now. "The year of our Lord, 1372. You froze. Surely you misheard. A joke, maybe. A prank. But there were no cameras, no tourists, no cell towers in sight, just the endless woods, the cold, the horse, the man with honest eyes and dirt beneath his nails. He noticed your expression. His tone softened. "You've been enchanted," he said with sudden gravity. "The Fae, perhaps. They take folk sometimes. Bring them back changed. You wanted to protest. To laugh. To explain that this was impossible. But how could you? There were no planes overhead, no hum of traffic, not a single sign of the modern world, just the smell of smoke on the wind and the distant call of a hunting horn." He offered his hand again. "Come. There's shelter ahead. You can tell me more there." And you followed him, through the woods, into a world that felt pulled from a forgotten tale. Where homes were made of timber and wattle, where names had weight and suspicion lingered in doorways. A world where the past was not behind you, but all around. As you walked, he spoke of the town, of the troubles in the north, of wolves growing bold in the woods, of a baron who taxed too much and a healer who lived alone by the marsh. And you listened, every word painting a new piece of a world that was not yours, but now might be. With every step, the air felt thicker with time, like walking into a dream where the pages of history had never been turned. Somewhere deep down, the question began to form: how and why did you come here? But the answer, for now, would have to wait, because just ahead, through the mist and trees, you saw the thatched rooftops of a village. And the story, your story, was only beginning. The village appeared as a smudge of warmth in the cold grey woods. Its cottages hunched together like gossiping elders, their thatched roofs slick with morning dew. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, mingling with mist that hung low over the uneven cobbled paths. The man, who had not yet given his name, led you forward with an ease born of familiarity. His boots struck the mud-soft path in slow, sure steps. Your own feet ached, not yet used to walking this far without the cushioning comforts of modern shoes. As you crossed the first invisible threshold into Ashcombe, you felt something subtle shift, as though the very air had changed. Time here did not rush. It lingered. Even the birdsong seemed to draw itself out slower and sweeter, as if the world had all the time it would ever need. The people of Ashcombe were beginning to stir. You saw them emerging from crooked doorways and narrow alleys. Women with scarves wrapped tightly over their heads, men carrying bundles of firewood, a sleepy child pulling a goat by a fraying rope. Their eyes flicked toward you, curiosity held barely in check. Some paused, stared longer than was polite. You caught murmured words under breath. Not cruel, not yet, just cautious. Your guide stopped outside a cottage with smoke trailing from the chimney and ivy crawling up its walls. He knocked once on the wooden door, not a sharp knock, but a low thump, and without waiting for an answer, pushed it open. The warmth inside greeted you like a blanket. A fire crackled in a hearth built from river stones, and herbs hung in bunches from the rafters, perfuming the room with rosemary and lavender and something bitter you couldn't name. The walls were lined with shelves stacked haphazardly with wooden bowls, pewter mugs and cloth-bound bundles. An old woman looked up from the spinning wheel in the corner. Her face was a maze of lines, her fingers knotted like roots. She blinked once slowly and then said in a voice that sounded like wind through reeds, "You bring me another stray, Osric." Your guide, Osric, nodded and turned toward you at last. "This is Mother Alice," he said. "She's the wisest one here, and perhaps the only one who'll know what to make of you." You managed a small bow, unsure of etiquette. "Thank you," you murmured. Mother Alice studied you with eyes as pale as mist, seeing not just your face, but something beneath it. After a long moment, she stood slowly and approached. She did not touch you, but circled you once, like an artist examining her subject. Then she exhaled. "You're not fey-touched," she said simply. "Not cursed, not enchanted." You were not sure whether to be relieved. "But you are strange," she added, tilting her head. "Woven from a thread this loom has not yet known." Osric crossed his arms. "He asked me the year, Alice. The year." She looked at him, then back to you. "And you didn't know it?" You shook your head. "Then you are far from where you began." She turned and gestured to the fire. "Sit, we'll feed you. You'll need your strength." You sat on a low stool near the hearth as Osric and Mother Alice moved around the room, fetching bread and a thin stew poured into a wooden bowl. The taste was earthy and strange, but filling. You ate in silence while they spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing at you as though you might vanish like a breath in the cold. When you finished, Alice poured you a cup of something hot and herbal. It soothed the chill inside you, but did nothing to settle the questions. "How did I get here?" you finally asked. She sat across from you now, her hands folded in her lap. "Some things do not come with answers," she said gently. "But stories, sometimes they leave clues." Osric leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. "Maybe he's a dreamer," he offered, "like those old tales. Folk who fall asleep in one world and wake in another." Alice did not smile. Or perhaps the old places have grown thin again, between the trees, between the stars, and the land took a breath, and in that breath you fell through. The room grew quiet. Outside, a bell rang in the village square, deep and resonant, calling the folk to market. Alice looked toward the window. The village will want to see him, Osric nodded. Best to let them. Curiosity grows into fear if left to rot. You stood, uncertain. Do I tell them the truth? She looked at you, long and calm. Only pieces of it. They fear what they do not know. You don't have a place here yet, and the world has little patience for things that don't fit neatly into its seams. Osric opened the door and waited. You followed him back into the village, where the sun had begun to climb the sky. It shone faintly, gold through cloud, casting long shadows between the stalls of market sellers. Fish glistened on wooden boards. Loaves of rough bread steamed beneath linen. Cloth dyed in uneven colours fluttered in the breeze. And eyes, dozens of them, turned to you. A child ran past you and then stopped, spinning around to stare. A man muttered and crossed himself. Two young women whispered behind a curtain of dyed wool. Osric spoke softly. Walk slow, say little. He led you through the market, past a blacksmith hammering iron and a cooper shaping wood. You smelled tallow, ash, and something sharp and metallic. You saw coins exchanged, not paper, but thick, uneven discs that clinked with weight. A man with a stern face, the reeve perhaps, approached and stopped Osric. You bring us a stranger, he said, eyes on you. Osric nodded. He was found in the woods. Confused, no harm in him. The reeve's gaze did not soften. And his name? Osric glanced at you. You hesitated. For a moment your real name felt absurd, out of place. It would sound foreign here, and dangerous. William, you said finally, the name tumbling out from some half-forgotten corner of your mind. Something safe, familiar enough to blend. The reeve gave a curt nod. William, he repeated slowly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Osric exhaled. That will do. You spent the rest of the morning in a blur of glances, whispers, and quiet tension. But slowly, as the sun warmed the rooftops and the market bustled louder, you began to vanish into the noise, just another face among many. By midday, Osric returned you to Aelis's cottage, where she had prepared a corner with a straw mattress and rough woolen blankets. Not soft, but warmer than the forest floor. She placed a hand gently on your shoulder. Sleep when you can, she said. You'll need your wits. And as you lay down, staring at the thatched ceiling above, your thoughts drifted back to your own world, distant now, unreal, and to the strange new thread of life slowly unwinding around you. Here, in the quiet bones of Ashcombe, your journey had just begun. The night came quietly to Ashcombe. It did not announce itself with blaring horns or humming streetlights, but with a hush, a slow dimming of the world, as though someone unseen was gently lowering a veil over the village. The sky deepened from grey to charcoal, clouds rolling across like ancient sails. A wind stirred, low and constant, and the scent of firewood and earth carried with it something older, something like memory. Inside the cottage, the fire had dwindled to embers. Aelis had long since settled into a quiet corner of her bed, her breathing steady and shallow. Osric had returned to his home before sunset, leaving you alone in a world that still felt like an elaborate dream from which you might wake at any moment. But sleep would not come easily. Your thoughts drifted, restless. The straw mattress beneath you scratched through the thin blanket, and the sounds outside, unfamiliar creaks, groans of wood, occasional far-off barks of dogs or the hoot of an owl, made the darkness feel thicker, more alive. You rose. Moonlight filtered through the small, warped glass of the cottage window. You pulled on the rough cloak Aelis had given you and stepped out into the night. The village looked different beneath the moon. Still and quiet, the crooked buildings leaned like dozing elders, their shadows long and strange. A single lantern swung gently on its post near the centre of the square, casting circles of amber light that barely pushed back the dark. You walked slowly, your footsteps muffled by the dirt path. There were no cars here, no engines humming through the silence, only the wind and the occasional rustle of some small creature darting beneath the eaves. You passed the market square, now empty. The stalls were covered with worn canvas, and a stray chicken pecked sleepily near the well. You wandered with no destination, letting your feet carry you where they might. Eventually, you found yourself at the edge of the village, where the woods met the homes, where cultivated land ended and the wild began. There, nestled between two leaning trees, was a small stone shrine. It looked ancient, worn by rain and wind, with moss crawling up its base and a carved figure in its centre, some faceless saint or forgotten spirit. You stepped closer. At its foot were bundles of dried flowers, a length of twisted wool, and what looked like a piece of bread left as offering. It was not Christian, at least not in any way you understood. You stared at it for a long time. Then, from behind, a voice, soft, low, unmistakably young, spoke. "You're the one they're whispering about." You turned. A girl stood there, no more than 15, her hair braided down her back, and her eyes bright despite the dark. She held a small bundle of firewood in her arms and wore a shawl too big for her narrow shoulders. "I didn't mean to startle you," she said, stepping forward. "I saw you from my window. You're the one they say came from nowhere." You nodded slowly. "I suppose I am." She tilted her head. "Are you really from across the sea, or are you one of the hill folk?" "I'm not from anywhere nearby," you said carefully. She smiled faintly, not pushing further. "I'm Ellen," she said. "My mother's the brewer. She says strangers never come here unless something bad's on the wind." You didn't know how to answer that. She looked toward the shrine. "You're not supposed to come out at night," she said, suddenly quiet. "Not near the edge. Not on moonless nights." "But there's a moon," you said, glancing up. She shook her head. "A gibbous moon doesn't count. That's what the old ones say." You followed her gaze to the trees. The forest seemed to shift there, darker than the rest of the night, almost like it breathed. You felt it too. A low hum just under the surface. Not sound, not sight, but presence. Ellen placed the firewood down gently near the shrine. "My grandmother said there are doors in the woods," she whispered, "but you don't see them unless they want you to. She said they're not always for going back either. Sometimes they bring things in." You looked at her. Your breath caught in your chest. "Do you believe that?" you asked. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained on the shrine. "I believe some things don't belong to the day," she said finally. "And some stories are true even if they never happened." She picked up a stone from the ground and placed it gently next to the bread. Then she turned back to you. "Be careful," she said, not as warning but as promise. "Ashcombe doesn't forget new faces." She disappeared down a narrow path between houses, her figure fading into shadow. You stood a while longer at the shrine, unsure of what you were feeling. The cold bit deeper now. The woods beyond seemed to whisper in a tongue just beyond hearing. Eventually, you returned to the cottage. Inside, the embers still glowed faintly. Alis had not stirred. You slipped beneath the blanket, your thoughts turning over themselves. Ellen's words echoed. Doors in the woods, stories true even if they never happened. And you began to wonder if you had stepped through one of those doors, and if so, whether it would ever open again. Dawn arrived not with the bright insistence of sunlight, but with a slow pale light that crept over the rooftops and spilled into the corners of Alis's cottage. The fire had died in the hearth, leaving only ash and a thin veil of smoke that smelled faintly of moss and sage. You woke to the sound of quiet rustling, Alis already stirring, her back turned as she moved deliberately around the room. She didn't speak at first, but her presence was grounding, as if the old beams of the cottage were held together by the rhythm of her movements. A kettle hung above a freshly sparked fire now, and a faint warmth returned to the air. "You wandered last night," she said at last, not accusing, just stating a truth. You sat up slowly. "I needed to think." She turned then, her expression unreadable. "The village has long memories. Best not to give them reasons to add your name to old fears." You nodded, and she softened. "But thinking is not a sin," she added. "It's what comes after that matters." She handed you a small bowl of warm porridge, coarsely milled and flecked with bits of dried apple. It was simple but comforting, and you ate quietly as she prepared herbs on the table, crushing them slowly with the back of a wooden spoon. The morning light made her hands look like weathered parchment, every wrinkle a tale untold. "There's a task today," she said, "one that will help you find footing." You looked up. "The Reeve sent word. There's illness at the edge of the village. The cooper's wife. I've made tinctures for her before, but she's taken a turn. I'm too old to walk the path in the cold." "You'll take the satchel." You hesitated, but nodded. Alis handed you a cloth bag filled with small glass vials and a pouch of dried herbs wrapped in waxed linen. A faint scent of rosemary and vinegar rose from its depths. "She lives near the brook," Alis explained. "End of the southern lane, past the smithy, the one with smoke that smells of pine. Tell her son who sent you." You bundled into the cloak she'd given you the day before and stepped out once more into the chill of the morning. Ashcombe was beginning to stir, though slower today. The sky was still heavy with cloud, and a fine mist hung over the village, muffling sound and muting colour. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. 2 boys ran past, chasing a wooden hoop with sticks, their laughter bright against the sleepy hush. You followed the path Alis described, past the blacksmith's hut, where sparks leapt from the open forge, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoing into the morning air. The smith barely glanced at you, too focused on the shape forming beneath his hammer. Beyond that, the homes grew smaller, more worn, and the road narrowed into a muddy trail lined with bare trees. You spotted the house. Sloped roof, sagging walls, and a thin stream of pine-scented smoke curling from the chimney. The brook gurgled nearby, its voice soft beneath the birdsong. You knocked gently. After a moment, the door creaked open and a boy of no more than 10 peered up at you. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red. "I've come from Alis," you said softly. "She sent medicines for your mother." He stared at you for a moment longer, then opened the door wider. Inside, the cottage was dim. A fire smouldered in the hearth, and a woman lay on a low bed by the far wall, her skin waxy, her breathing shallow and laboured. A damp cloth rested on her forehead, and her lips were cracked with fever. You approached quietly and knelt beside her, untying the satchel with clumsy fingers. You weren't a healer, not truly. But Alis had told you what to do. Which vial to use, how much to pour, what herb to steep in hot water. The boy watched from the corner, silent and wide-eyed, as you mixed the tincture and held it gently to his mother's lips. She coughed, but drank. You repeated the process, waiting between each step, letting the room settle into stillness between movements. Outside, the wind shifted, and you heard the caw of a crow, close and sharp. After a time, the woman's breathing deepened slightly. Her face relaxed just a little. You turned to the boy. "She needs warmth," you said, "and water. I'll leave the rest of these with you." He nodded, his lips pressed tight, too scared to speak. You stood, feeling the ache in your knees and the quiet weight of responsibility pressing deeper into your chest. There was no applause, no certainty, just the faint smell of pine, the wheeze of shallow breath, and the knowledge that for now you'd done what could be done. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly. The path back seemed clearer, though the village still looked as though it slumbered beneath a shroud of memory. As you walked, you passed by a stone wall, half crumbled, with ivy crawling like veins over its surface. A figure stood there. You hadn't seen them approach. It was a man, older than you, but not by much. He wore a long brown cloak with a wooden clasp carved in the shape of a raven. His eyes were pale grey, like frost, and he watched you in a way that made the world seem suddenly still. "You're the one from the woods," he said, not a question. You stopped. "I am," you replied, unsure what else to say. He nodded slowly. "The wind has changed since you came." He stepped closer, his boots silent on the wet earth. "Do you know what day it is?" You frowned. "Thursday?" His lips curved into a faint smile. "Here it is St. Hilda's Eve. The veil is thin tonight." You didn't understand. He seemed to study your confusion with interest. "Some say the saints keep watch," he said. "Others say the old gods rise." You opened your mouth to ask more, but he turned and began to walk away, his cloak brushing the ivy-covered wall. "Be wary," he said, without turning. "Doors open both ways." And then he was gone. You stood there a long moment, uncertain whether to follow or return. In the end, your feet led you back to Alis. She was seated by the hearth, shelling beans. "How is she?" Alis asked without looking up. "Still breathing," you said. "Resting." She nodded as though that was all that mattered. You sat across from her, the fire casting slow shadows on the walls. "There's a man," you said at last. "With a raven clasp." He knew who I was and stilled. "Did he speak your name?" "No." She resumed her work. "Then he's only half dangerous." You looked at her, searching her face for more. But she said nothing. The beans clicked softly into the bowl. The fire popped, sending up a brief trail of sparks. And outside, the wind carried with it the faint sound of distant bells, low and slow, tolling for something not yet named. Night in Ashcombe returned with a gentler tread than the one before, as though it had grown used to your presence, or perhaps had simply grown curious. The air was colder now, laced with the damp scent of frost settling into the thatch and earth. Above, the sky had cleared in part, revealing stars. Not a blanket of them like the countryside stargazing you remembered, but sparse and far apart, like watchful eyes blinking through layers of ancient mist. Inside Ailys's cottage, the fire was higher tonight. She had thrown in bunches of dried juniper and something resinous that crackled blue at the edges. The smell was sharper than usual, and the smoke carried a subtle bite that lingered in the air. You sat near the hearth, arms wrapped around your knees, watching shadows dance on the old wooden beams. Ailys moved with deliberate calmness, pouring something thick and dark into a bowl carved from elderwood. "It's St. Hilda's Eve," she said, breaking the silence without looking up. "The longest night before the winter truly sinks its claws in." You remembered the man by the ivy wall, the raven clasp, his voice low like falling snow. "What did he mean about doors opening both ways?" you asked. Ailys placed the bowl on a low stool and finally turned to you. "There are nights," she said slowly, "when the world's skin grows thin, when old things stir and old paths open. Some are between places, some between times." You blinked, your breath catching. "You mean like—" you started. "I mean," she cut in gently, "you were not the first to fall through one." Her eyes reflected the firelight, soft and heavy with memory. "There are stories," she continued, "told only when the wind's in the east and the hearth is high, of a monk who vanished from his scriptorium and reappeared 100 years later, still clutching his quill, of a child who wandered into the woods chasing a light and returned grown and silent, never speaking again, of a woman who fell asleep in a chapel and woke to find the building swallowed by ivy and no one who remembered her name." She paused, her hands resting on her knees. "Some say it's the work of the Fae. Others blame spirits or saints or the bones of the earth itself. But those who return, they always return changed." The room felt smaller suddenly, the shadows thicker. "And what happens," you asked quietly, "to the ones who don't return?" Ailys exhaled slowly. "They become part of the land." You shivered despite the fire. She stood and pulled a small bundle from the wall, wrapped in red cloth and tied with string made of twisted bark. "I want you to carry this," she said, handing it to you. It was light but oddly warm in your palm. "What is it?" "Protection," she replied. "Not against wolves or thieves, against forgetting." "Forget what?" "Who you are, where you began. The doors may be old, but they are hungry." You held the bundle carefully, unsure whether to thank her or fear her. That night, you did not sleep easily. You lay awake, listening to the wind pick up, rustling the dried herbs and causing the shutters to groan. The fire dimmed to glowing embers, but Ailys did not add more wood. She sat awake beside it, silently spinning flax from an old spindle, her gaze distant. Somewhere past midnight, you heard bells again, not the dull toll of iron like before, but smaller, lighter, like silver wind chimes far away. They rang 3 times, then stopped. You sat up. "Did you hear that?" Ailys did not look up. "They always ring on this night. The hill calls." "The hill?" She nodded slowly. "Barrowmere." You remembered passing it on your first walk with Osric. A low rise in the land capped with gnarled trees and surrounded by standing stones. At the time, it had seemed simply a place too rocky to build upon. But now the name felt heavier, older. "What's there?" you asked. "Things best left alone." But her answer only sharpened the edge of your curiosity. By morning, the frost clung white to the windows and the village wore a quiet, watchful expression. The usual morning bustle was slower, quieter, and even the livestock seemed subdued. No birds called. The crows that had circled the day before were gone. A knock came at the door. It was Osric. His cloak was dusted with frost, and his hair curled damply against his forehead. "You'd best come," he said, not unkindly. "There's talk." You followed him through the frozen village. The streets were nearly empty, and those who were outside watched from behind scarves or hoods. You noticed more iron hanging over door frames now. Horseshoes, blades of rusted scythes, even twisted nails hammered into beams. "Is it always like this?" you asked. "Just today?" he said, "until the sun passes the hill's shadow. And then the air clears again." He brought you to the square where the reeve waited, flanked by 2 other men with hard-set jaws and fur-trimmed collars. The reeve looked at you, his eyes narrowing. "There was movement near Barrowmere last night," he said. "Tracks in the frost." Was it animals? You asked. Not all of it, he replied. Some of the prints were bare. He let the words settle like stones dropped into a still pond. Osric stepped forward. He was with Alice all night. I passed by her window before dawn. The Reeve nodded slowly. I don't claim it was him, he said, but the village feels stretched today, like a bow drawn too tight. He turned to you. Stay within sight. Do not go to the trees. And if you hear bells, I'll come back, you finished. His gaze lingered, then he turned and walked off. Osric sighed. He's trying not to fear you. That's the best you'll get. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. You helped Alice grind herbs, clean roots, and wrap bundles of bark for trade. At midday, she sent you to Ellen's family to deliver a tincture for cough, and the girl met you at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Did you dream last night? She asked as she took the vial. No, you said. Not that I remember. Good, she replied. It means they didn't find you. You wanted to ask who or what she meant, but something in her tone stopped you. The sun dipped behind Barrowmere just before supper, and the village seemed to exhale. Doors creaked open again. The forge roared to life. A child laughed, sharp and unexpected, and was quickly hushed. That evening, as you stood at the window of the cottage, the moon rose clean and full. Alice came to stand beside you, her hands clasped. Now the worst is past, she said, but the land remembers. It always does. And as you looked out at the thatched roofs and curling chimneys, at the dark line of the forest and the silhouette of the standing stones on the hill, you wondered how much the land already remembered you. The following days in Ashcombe passed in a quiet rhythm, like a slow-turning wheel. Each spoke a repetition of the last, yet subtly changed. The frost lingered longer in the mornings, painting window panes with delicate veins of white. The sun, when it rose, cast a pale gold across the village but brought little warmth. Life, however, moved forward. Children gathered kindling. Carts creaked through muddy lanes, and the smell of stew and smoke curled out of every crooked chimney. You were beginning to understand the way time worked here, not in seconds or minutes or hours, but in tasks, in duties, in cycles that looped with the seasons. Morning meant water from the well, midday meant trade or tending, and evening meant sitting near the fire, listening more than speaking. It was not fast, but it was full. Alice taught you more with each sunrise. She showed you how to identify herbs by their scent when the leaves had frozen, how to dry rootstocks near the fire without blackening them, how to recognise the sound of sick lungs before the cough began. She was not soft in her teaching, but she was patient. And in the lull between lessons, she told you stories. Old stories. Not the kind you remembered from books or bedtime tales, but ones laced with nettle and ash, with grief and warning. Stories where the hero rarely triumphed and the forest was never just trees. There was one in particular, she told with a kind of reverence. Long ago, she began one cold morning as you wrapped bundles of nettle to dry. Before Ashcombe was Ashcombe, before the church bell rang and the fields were fenced, there was a grove in the northern woods, older than the stone circles, older than the barrow. You glanced up. Her voice had grown quieter, though no one else was near. They say it was planted by hands that did not bleed, the kind of hands that whisper instead of speak. In that grove, time folds like cloth, and sometimes, only sometimes, it tears. You said nothing, sensing the tale had only just begun. One winter, she continued, a woman from the village wandered too far. Her child had taken ill, and she sought a herb that grew only in deep shade. She passed into the northern wood at dawn and did not return for 3 days. When she came back, her basket was full, but she did not speak, not that day nor any day after. You paused your work. What happened to her? She lived another 10 years, Alice said, raised her son, tended her garden, but her eyes were never quite focused. She never went to church again, and on her last day she whispered 3 words. None could understand them, not even the priest. Did she find the grove? Alice's hands stilled. She found something. The tale left an odd weight in the air, one that clung even as the sun crept higher. Later that afternoon, Osric returned. He knocked on the door, snow dusting his shoulders, a streak of soot across his cheek. There's been a collapse near the old quarry, he said. North edge of the wood, 2 boys caught beneath. Alice rose with a sharpness you hadn't seen before. Bring them here. Osric hesitated. We'll need your help. One's leg is pinned. We can't move him without risking the break." Without a word, Alis packed salves, splints, and a jar of thick black ointment that smelled of pine tar and vinegar. Then she turned to you. "Bring the lantern and the water skin. You'll come too." The walk was long and cold, and the path narrowed as the trees thickened. The sun had begun to fall, and shadows leaned long across the snow. When you reached the edge of the quarry, a group of villagers stood in a tense huddle, faces drawn tight with worry. A boy sat wrapped in blankets, his face tear-streaked and red. Another lay deeper within the hollow, half covered by fallen stone and earth. You followed Alis down the slope. Osric joined you with a crowbar and a flat board for a stretcher. The boy was conscious, though his lips trembled from more than just cold. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, pinned beneath a slab of stone. "It hurts," he gasped when Alis touched the wound. "I know," she said, "but I will not lie. It will hurt more before it hurts less." She looked to you. "Hold the lantern steady and be ready to press here." She pointed just above the boy's knee. You knelt, hands shaking as you took position. Osric wedged the crowbar beneath the stone and, on Alis's command, pushed with a grunt of effort. The stone shifted. The boy screamed. You pressed. Blood welled beneath the cloth. Alis worked fast, cleaning, binding, straightening, with the certainty of someone who had seen worse. When it was done, the boy was silent, half fainted from pain. You helped slide him onto the board, then joined the others to lift and carry. It was past dusk when you returned to Ashcombe. The boy was laid in his mother's cottage. Alis left instructions, more tinctures, and a charm tied with red thread over the door. "You did well," she said to you as you walked back beneath the first stars. You wanted to believe her. But as you neared the village edge, something drew your gaze north. Where the trees thickened and the sky above seemed somehow darker, deeper, there was a flicker there, not firelight, not moonlight, just the faintest suggestion of movement, of something shifting behind the bark and bramble. You stopped, staring. A voice, quiet and low, seemed to echo inside you. Folded cloth. Then it was gone. You turned to see Alis watching you. She said nothing, but her eyes told you she had seen the flicker too. The days that followed were colder still. Snow came, not in a storm, but as a soft and steady whisper, blanketing Ashcombe in a hush that seemed to muffle even the thoughts in your mind. Each morning, smoke rose more slowly from the chimneys. Paths turned to narrow tunnels of trampled snow between the buildings. The brook near the Cooper's cottage froze at the edges, and children broke it with sticks to watch the shards drift downstream like broken mirrors. The village withdrew into itself. Conversations grew shorter, eyes lingered longer. People passed you with nods, some colder than others. A few offered faint smiles. Ellen waved once from the brewer's doorway, her fingers red with cold, her braid tucked into a scarf. But even she seemed quieter now. Inside the cottage, Alis moved less. She remained near the hearth most days, wrapped in layers of wool and silence. Her hands still worked, shelling beans, grinding dried roots, stitching cloth sachets with careful fingers, but her voice had grown thin like breath on glass. You noticed the change before she spoke of it. Her steps were slower, her hands trembled when lifting the kettle. The cough that had once come only at night began to creep into the day. Still, she said nothing, only watched you more often, her eyes measuring something she would not name. On the 5th morning after the quarry, you woke to find her already sitting by the fire. A piece of parchment spread across the table. The ink glistened faintly in the candlelight. Runes and symbols you did not recognise, curved like roots, dense like storm clouds. She looked up. "I've written it down," she said softly. You moved closer. "Written what?" "The path." You stared at the parchment. "I don't understand." "You will, when it's time." You sat beside her. The fire popped. She stared into it as though reading something there. "I've lived in Ashcombe all my life," she said. "My mother too, and her mother before her. But our line didn't start here. We come from the edge, where the forest touches places that bend." She touched the parchment, fingers brushing the ink. "There are threads beneath this world," she continued, "woven deep, and sometimes, if you learn the knots, you can follow them back." A silence stretched between you. The fire danced its slow rhythm. "Back where?" you asked. She looked at you, and for the first time, her eyes were not tired. They were clear, almost young. "Home," she said. For you, maybe, or for me. You didn't know what to say. Alice turned the parchment, folding it with care and tucking it into a small wooden box. She placed the box on the mantel. When I am gone, she said, that is yours. You felt the words settle like snow in your chest. Heavy, cold, final. The rest of the day passed in quiet motions. You chopped wood behind the cottage. Your hands blistered despite the gloves she had sewn for you. The axe was old, the handle worn smooth, but it worked. The rhythm of chopping grounded you, a cadence of breath and effort, of frost and fire. Each swing scattered white dust into the air, each log split with a sound like bones giving way. At midday, Osric arrived. He brought bread and a cut of venison wrapped in cloth. His beard was iced with snow, and his voice held concern beneath its usual calm. She looks worse, he said, nodding toward the cottage. She is, you replied. He sighed. There's a healer east of the marsh. Merelda lives alone. She's not like Alice, not trusted, but she knows old things, wild things, things that sting before they soothe. You hesitated. Would she help? She might. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small brass ring, plain and heavy. Give her this. It's iron-forged. She'll take it as trade. You nodded, slipping it into your pocket. She lives past the fen, he added. Follow the trail of black reeds. Don't leave it. You left at first light the next day, wrapped in your thickest cloak, the ring tucked deep in your glove. The marshlands spread beyond Ashcombe like an exhale, flat, frozen, vast. Reeds rattled in the wind and the sky hung low above, heavy with grey. Frost clung to everything. Your breath rose in slow plumes as you walked, boots crunching across half-frozen earth. The path was narrow and winding, marked by twisted sticks bound in black ribbon. Crows watched from distant trees. Once you saw a fox, gaunt, its fur patchy, its eyes bright with hunger, before it vanished into the brush. After nearly 2 hours you saw her home. It looked less like a cottage and more like a wound in the earth, sunken with a roof of sod and moss, its doorway arched like a gaping mouth. Smoke trickled from a bent pipe. Bones, bird and rodent alike, hung in small bundles over the door. You knocked once. The door opened as if it had been expecting you. Merelda was small, her spine curved like a question mark. Her hair hung in wild ropes around her shoulders, streaked with grey and rust. Her eyes, one clouded white, the other piercing green, stared at you without blinking. You carry sorrow, she rasped, and something stranger. You held out the iron ring. She took it without looking. Speak your need, she said. You told her. About Alice, about the cough. About the fading. Merelda nodded slowly. She walks near the edge. Can you help her? She turned and disappeared inside. You followed. The interior of her home smelled of mould, resin, and something sweetly rotting. Herbs hung in tangled bunches from the rafters. A fire crackled in a hearth of clay and bone. Merelda began to grind roots into a thick paste, adding crushed bark, powder from a red vial, and drops of black liquid that sizzled when they hit the bowl. She must drink it before sunset, she said, pouring the mixture into a sealed flask of horn, and not a drop more than one mouthful. You took the flask with care. She reached into a pouch and drew out a length of thread, red, coarse, warm to the touch. Tie this around her wrist, before she sleeps. You nodded. As you turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice thin as ice on water. Your shadow is long, stranger, and it does not always follow you. You looked back. What does that mean? But she had already vanished behind a curtain of dried leaves. You returned to Ashcombe as the sun lowered, your legs stiff with cold, your thoughts tangled and raw. Inside the cottage, Alice was asleep. You woke her gently, gave her the drink, tied the thread. She did not ask questions, only drank, grimaced, and drifted once more into silence. That night, as the fire burned low and you watched the rise and fall of her breath, you heard the bells again. Faint, distant, shivering through the dark. And for the first time you did not wonder where they came from. You wondered if they had always been following you. Morning broke slowly. A pale light seeped through the window panes, barely pushing back the shadows that clung to the corners of Alice's cottage. You awoke in your usual place near the hearth, a thin blanket draped around your shoulders, the dying fire reduced to a bed of sleepy embers. And silence. No cough. No wheezing breath. You sat up, your heart tight in your chest. Alice lay still in her bed, her hands folded over her chest, the red thread still wrapped around her wrist. Her face, worn as old parchment, looked oddly peaceful. You rose, crossed the room on bare feet. For a moment you thought she had slipped away in the night. But then her chest rose, shallow but steady. She was breathing, alive. You exhaled the breath you hadn't realized you were holding. She stirred at the sound and opened her eyes. They were clearer than they had been in days. "You went to the marsh," she said, her voice rough but lucid. You nodded. "I didn't ask," she added, "but I'm glad you did." She struggled to sit and you helped her. Her fingers gripped your wrist tightly, too tightly for someone so weak. When she released you, a pale red mark remained on your skin. "Thank you," she said, and in her eyes something quiet flickered. Not just gratitude, something more complex. Resignation, perhaps, or warning. You gave her broth, thickened with roots and lentils, and she drank slowly. Her strength was not returning fast, but it was returning, and in this land, that was all one could ask. Word of her recovery spread through Ashcombe with surprising speed. Before midday, there was a knock at the door, a baker's boy with a round of black bread wrapped in cloth. Then a girl from the weaving house brought a twist of honeycomb. Osric arrived in the afternoon with fresh game wrapped in oilskin and a silent nod that said everything words could not. That evening, you sat outside the cottage for the first time in days. Snow still covered the ground in patches, but the air was lighter now, the wind less sharp. The trees, dark and tall beyond the village, seemed to whisper more softly than before, like they too had been waiting. Ellen joined you near dusk. She sat beside you without a word, her cloak dusted with flour, a strand of hair loose from her braid. "I heard she's better," she said. "She is." "That's good." You waited, sensing more behind her quiet. Then she said, "I saw them." You turned to her. "What?" "The bells," she whispered. "Last night I heard them, like I do every winter, but I also saw them in the trees." A long pause. "They don't walk," she added, voice barely audible. "They float, almost like light, but the light's wrong. It doesn't glow. It pulls." You felt the hairs on your arms rise. "I didn't follow," she said. "Not like the others, but they look for someone new every year." You looked away toward the edge of the forest. "Have they ever taken anyone?" She nodded slowly. "My uncle, when I was 7, he went to cut firewood one morning and never came back. They say he must have drowned in the fen or gone north, but my mother doesn't believe that. She says the bells came closer that year. Louder." You wanted to speak, but found no words. Ellen stood. "They won't knock on the door," she said. "They just wait for it to open." That night, you barred the windows. You built the fire higher than usual. Alice slept soundly, her breath slow and even, the red thread still wrapped around her wrist like a seal. You sat with your back to the hearth, the small wooden box she'd left for you still untouched on the mantel. Something in you feared it. Not what it was, but what it might unlock. Hours passed. You must have drifted, not fully asleep but not entirely awake. A thin veil settled over your senses, and in that space you heard the sound again. Not outside, inside. A bell, soft, silver, cold, rang behind your eyes. You opened them to see the fire had dimmed to coals. The cottage was still, but not empty. A figure stood near the door, not quite a person, more a shape, a vertical length of shadow darker than the rest, faintly outlined in silver, as if it absorbed the firelight rather than reflected it. You did not move. The air was still and thick, your breath held in your chest like glass waiting to shatter. The figure didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It simply stood and watched. The bell sounded again, not from its hands, for they were not visible. The sound came from within it, or from somewhere beyond it. Then, as softly as mist lifting from a river, it began to fade, not walking, not stepping, just vanishing. The shadow unravelled like ink in water until nothing remained. You sat in silence long after it had gone. Then slowly rose and stepped to Alice's bed. She was still there, still breathing, her brow uncreased, but the thread on her wrist had unravelled. The red string now lay in a loose spiral beside her hand, as though gently removed. You picked it up. The warmth had left it, and though the fire still glowed and the door had never opened, the chill that entered the cottage that night was not one the hearth could chase away. The morning after the shadow came was brittle with cold. Ice had crept up the inside of the windows overnight, forming delicate patterns that resembled runes or frost-bitten ivy. The air in the cottage hung heavy, not just with the scent of wood smoke and dried thyme, but with something older, something hollow. Even the sound of your breath felt louder in the hush. Alice awoke with a murmur, turning toward the warmth of the hearth. She didn't seem to notice the red thread, now coiled beside her pillow like a shed skin. Her eyes were brighter than they had been in days, and her voice, though hoarse, carried a kind of clarity that felt like something sharpening beneath the surface. You said nothing of the shadow, not yet. Instead, you prepared tea from the bundle of herbs Merelda had sent with the tincture, steeping it slowly in hot water until the sharp smell filled the room. Alice drank in silence, her gaze lingering on the flames. Finally, she spoke. I dreamed of the trees, she said, of branches growing backward, of roots reaching into the sky. You paused. Do you remember anything else? She nodded. There was a bell, not a church bell, a thin one. It rang once, and every sound in the dream stopped. Not went quiet. Stopped. Like it had never been there. You sat across from her, the fire casting flickering gold across the stone floor. There was something in here last night, you said quietly. I didn't open the door. Alice closed her eyes. Then it found a way. You reached into your pocket and placed the unravelled thread on the table. I think it came for you. She opened her eyes again and looked at it. Or it came because of me. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the bare trees against the roof. The sound was dry, whispering. Do you believe it's from the grove? You asked. She didn't answer for a long time. I believe, she said finally, that there are places where the veil thins because something wants it to, and there are people born with the kind of thread that snags in the seams. You leaned forward. What kind of thread? The kind that pulls both ways. You stared into the fire, letting her words settle into you like embers into ash. Later that day, the Reeve sent for you. Osric came to the door, wrapped in a heavy cloak lined with fur. His brow was furrowed deeper than usual, his gloved hands clenched. There's been a finding, he said. He didn't elaborate. You followed him through the village. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes spinning in slow spirals. Ashcombe looked stiller than usual, the usual morning movements paused or hidden. You passed the market square, where the stalls stood bare, and made your way north, toward the wood's edge. A group of villagers had gathered near the line where trees rose from the earth like the ribs of some sleeping beast. The Reeve stood beside them, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He pointed to the snow. Tracks. At first they looked like deer prints, neat, sharp, deep, but something was wrong. Each track was longer than your foot, narrower than a hoof, and spaced too evenly, like something walking upright. Then you saw the rest. Not far from the tree line lay a patch where the snow had melted in an almost perfect circle. In the centre, pressed into the earth like a seal, was a mark. A pattern of interlocking rings woven into each other like a braid, not carved, not stamped, as though the soil itself had grown that way. The Reeve turned to you. You've seen something, he said, not accusing, not demanding, just expecting. You nodded. A shadow, you said. 2 nights passed, in Alice's home. He glanced toward the trees. And did it speak? No, he exhaled slowly. Then it hasn't chosen yet. Osric looked at him sharply. You said the grove was a myth. The Reeve ignored him. He turned to you again. I want you to stay close for now. Don't stray. And if it comes again, let it speak. Whatever it wants, it's waiting for a reason. As the crowd dispersed, a woman stepped forward, old, hunched, wrapped in too many shawls. She held out a scrap of parchment. Your hand, she said to you. You hesitated, but gave it. She placed the parchment in your palm. Her fingers were cold, brittle. Then she leaned forward and whispered, There are those in this village who remember how the first door opened. You looked into her clouded eyes. Which door? The one that brought you here. And then she turned and walked away. You unfolded the parchment. It was covered in small, precise symbols, not words, but shapes. Some resembled trees, others knots. One near the centre looked uncannily like the pattern left in the soil. You tucked it inside your coat. That night, Alice sat at the table for the first time in days. She ate slowly, spooning broth with trembling fingers. You told her of the tracks, the melted ring, the Reeve's warning. When you finished, she pushed her bowl aside. There's something you need to see, she said. She rose and walked to the mantel. From behind a row of dried lavender bundles, she withdrew a leather-bound book, not large but old. The spine cracked as she opened it. Inside were pages filled with drawings. Charcoal and ink, water-stained, wrinkled with age. Symbols, creatures, places. Some looked familiar, others stirred unease in you, though you didn't know why. She turned to a page near the middle. It was a map, rough, hand-drawn, but you recognised the shape of the village, the well, the blacksmith's forge, and beyond that, to the north, a path that didn't exist on any road you'd seen. A narrow line winding into the trees. At its end was a mark, a spiral within a spiral, just like the one in the snow. The first path, she said. They buried it long ago, covered the stones, let the forest take it. You traced the line with your finger. It's still there? She nodded. But the only way to see it, she whispered, is to follow when you're not meant to, when the veil is thin, when the bells are near. You looked at her, and in her eyes you saw something you hadn't before. She had known this would come, maybe not the shape or the time, but the pull, the inevitable unwinding of a thread that had begun the moment you woke in the moss. You looked again at the map and felt the weight of something opening. The day passed with a deceptive calm. Ashcombe carried on its quiet rituals. Snow was swept from doorsteps, wood was chopped and stacked against cottages, and the village children skated on a frozen stretch of brook near the South Bend. But beneath it all was a shared silence, an awareness, like an animal waiting for the snap of a twig that never quite came. You felt it most when no one spoke your name, not even in whispers. As if naming you aloud would risk drawing attention from things not entirely of this world. That afternoon you studied the map Alice had shown you. Its lines were uneven, hand-drawn with the weight of memory rather than precision. Some landmarks had changed, others were entirely unfamiliar. The trees it described to the north, just past the ancient well that no longer stood, were marked with small crosses, a warning perhaps, or a guide. Beside one cross, faintly scribbled, was a word written in a script only barely legible, Falthorn. You repeated the name under your breath, feeling the shape of it. It had no meaning in your mind, but it clung to your tongue like a taste from a half-remembered dream. Alice rested in her chair, watching you from the corner of the room. When you reach the black tree, she said, voice slow and even, do not step to its left. That's where the ground remembers. You turned to her. Remembers what? The ones who asked for more than they were given. She returned her gaze to the fire. By dusk, a thin fog had settled across the village. It wound its way through alleys and over rooftops like a living thing. Even the trees looked quieter beneath its touch, and the bells did not ring that night. But somehow that absence was louder than any chime. You waited until long after dark. Alice had fallen into a light sleep, her breathing soft. You wrapped yourself in the thick cloak Osric had given you weeks ago and tucked the parchment map against your chest. The box she had left for you, your inheritance of sorts, still sat unopened on the mantel. You considered it, then left it where it was. Some things felt like endings before they began. Outside, the fog swallowed the village whole. It wasn't blinding. You could still see a few paces ahead, but the world around you had lost its shape. Edges blurred. Colours dulled. Sound grew heavy, padded and slow. You passed the well, past the forge, silent now and cold. You followed the narrow trail Alice had traced with her finger, past the old orchard, over the frost-crumbled fence and toward the north woods. And there, beyond the trees that edged the boundary of the village like sentinels, you found it. A gap between two gnarled oaks, half concealed by a curtain of winter vines. The opening was narrow, almost too narrow, and the trees leaned in as if trying to hide it. You stepped through. Beyond was silence. Not the silence of night or fog or snow, but something denser. Like the air itself had forgotten how to carry sound. The trees grew closer here, taller. Their branches arched overhead, not quite touching, but laced in such a way that no starlight could filter through. You lit the lantern Alice had given you, and the glow cast trembling shadows on bark that was too smooth, too pale. And then, as you turned a bend in the path, you saw it, the black tree. It stood alone in a small clearing, tall and still, its bark like scorched iron. No snow touched its branches, no birds nested in its limbs. Around it, the air hung strangely warm and the snow underfoot thinned into slush and soil. You stepped toward it carefully. The ground to the left of the tree looked undisturbed, but you remembered Alice's warning and turned to the right instead. As your boots sank into the softened earth, you felt it shift beneath you, not sinking, not giving way, but adjusting, as though recognizing you. Ahead, a row of stones jutted from the earth, weathered and half buried, some leaning, some cracked. Standing stones, perhaps, or markers. One of them bore the spiral within a spiral symbol. You stepped closer. At the base of the stone lay something wrapped in old linen, a bundle, frayed and brittle. You knelt and with gentle hands unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden token, carved in the shape of a key, not a key for a lock, but a key for a place. As you held it, the air lifted. Wind stirred through the clearing, not cold wind, but warm and dry, scented with something faintly metallic. The lantern dimmed, the fog thickened, and then it parted. Not like mist, like a curtain. A line opened in the air ahead of you, between two stones. It shimmered, not with light, but with absence. A cut in the fabric of the world, no wider than a door. You stepped closer. A sound pulsed in your ears, not bells, not wind, but something deep and steady. A rhythm, a breath, your breath. You raised the wooden token. The shimmer responded, bending, widening, humming, and there it was, a path. Straight, narrow, lined with trees you had never seen, and leaves that glowed faintly in shades no language could describe. The path didn't lead through the forest. It led through time, not forward, not backward, just away. You didn't cross the threshold, not yet. You stepped back. The shimmer pulsed once, then slowly closed like a sigh, vanishing into the fog. The key grew cold in your hand. You returned to the clearing, heart pounding, breath uneven. The black tree remained still. But as you turned to leave, you saw something new carved into its bark, fresh, red, glistening. Your name, not the one you'd given the villagers, your true name. And beneath it, another word, chosen. You ran through the trees, through the mist, past the spiraled stone and the leaning roots, back toward the village, toward the lights, toward the known. But you knew then, without question, something had seen you, and now it would wait. By the time you reached the edge of Ashcombe, your breath burned in your lungs and your legs ached with every step. The fog had begun to lift, peeled away by the weight of the night's unfolding. But still, the village looked different, tilted slightly, subtly, as though viewed through a pane of rippled glass. Chimneys smoked, doors remained shut, yet something had shifted. You paused at the well, hands braced on its frost-glazed stones. The air smelled faintly of ash and lichen. You could still feel the warmth of the clearing on your skin, though it had been lost to the winter air long ago. Inside Aelis's cottage, the fire had nearly gone out. A few weak coals glowed beneath a blanket of ash. She was awake, wrapped in layers, watching the door as though she had known the exact moment you would return. "You found it," she said. You stepped in and closed the door behind you. "I did," you replied. You removed your gloves with stiff fingers and held the carved token out in your palm. She looked at it for a long time but did not touch it. "You opened the veil," she murmured. "It answered you." You nodded slowly. "Then it knows your name." Her voice was heavy with something you hadn't heard before. Not fear, not exactly, more like wariness, the kind one feels when an old truth finally arrives, even if long expected. "It carved it into the tree," you said. That caught her attention. She sat forward, brows furrowing. "And the other word?" You hesitated. "Chosen!" Aelis closed her eyes. Her breath came slow and thin. "There's no going back now," she whispered. You sat across from her, the token still clenched in your fist. "What does it want?" She opened her eyes and looked at you with sadness. "It doesn't want. Not in the way we understand. The veil, the path, the grove. It is not sentient, but it sees, it remembers. And when it finds something or someone woven with the right thread, it listens." To what? To the question you don't even know you're asking. You sat in silence, the fire crackling gently between you. "What if I don't want it?" you asked. Aelis's gaze did not waver. "Then it will wait." You placed the token on the table. Its surface was smooth but faintly warm, like a stone that had rested too long in sunlight. A quiet hum seemed to come from it. Not sound exactly, but vibration. It pulsed, barely perceptible, like a heartbeat beneath skin. You looked up. "Have you ever walked the path?" Her hands, so often steady, trembled as she reached for a bundle of cloth at her side. She untied it with slow fingers and unfolded a second map. This one older, more faded. The ink nearly vanished, but the spiral was there, the black tree, the path. "I did," she said, "once, long ago." You said nothing. "I followed it on the 13th winter of my life," she continued. Before I had a name that meant anything, before Ashcombe knew who I was, I found the door as you did. I walked it, and when I returned, I was not the same." Her voice cracked. She took a long breath before continuing. "I didn't remember it all at once, but I woke with a word in my mouth, one I had never spoken, and a scar on my chest in the shape of a key." You stared at her, heart pounding. "What did it show you?" She looked past you then, to a place far beyond the walls of the cottage. Versions of the world. Not dreams, not illusions, possibilities, threads untangled and rewoven. I saw Ashcombe burning. I saw myself, old and alone, beneath a tree that bled. I saw my mother as a child. I saw my death. You swallowed hard. "Why did you come back?" She looked at you, "Because I wasn't ready to stay." Outside, the wind picked up. It howled against the roof like a long, drawn breath. The flames flickered. "You might be," she said softly. You leaned forward. "What's on the other side of the path?" She didn't answer. You pressed. "If it can carry me through time, through memory, if it brought me here, can it take me home?" Her face changed. Just slightly. A shadow behind her eyes. "Maybe," she said, and that word stayed in your mind like a splinter. That evening, Osric arrived at the door. His cloak was heavy with snow, his boots muddied. "You've been seen," he said without preamble. "Where?" "Near the standing stones. The shepherd's boy swore he saw you vanish." You stiffened. "I didn't vanish." Then the boy saw what the path wanted him to see. Osric stepped inside, his eyes falling to the token on the table. "You opened it," he said quietly. "I didn't go through." "Yet." He turned to Alice. "How long?" "Not long," she said. "The path grows hungry after it opens. It won't wait forever." Osric nodded slowly, then turned to you. "There's something I never told you," he said. "About my brother." You watched him closely. He was touched by the veil, not taken, not lost, just marked, as you are. He saw things, drew them, woke with words that made no sense. Then one night he walked into the trees, no map, no light, just the sound of the bells. And Osric looked down. He returned a year later, wearing clothes no one had seen, hair grey, eyes wrong. He didn't speak for 3 days. Then when he did, he said only this: "I remembered too soon." He exhaled. Then he disappeared again. No trace, nothing left. You stared into the fire. The flames danced in time with the pulse of the token. "What if I wait?" you asked. "What if I never take another step?" Osric shrugged. "Then it will walk for you." That night, long after both of them had fallen asleep, you sat with the token in your hands. The lantern was low, the cottage quiet. You studied the map once more, fingers tracing the spiral, and for the first time you heard it clearly. Not a sound, but a word formed behind your thoughts, soft as breath. Come, not a demand, an invitation, and you didn't know even then whether the voice had come from the path or from something buried within yourself. You rose before dawn. The sky outside the cottage was ink dark, a single bruise of blue pressed against the horizon. The wind had calmed, and the world lay still beneath a cover of freshly fallen snow, unbroken, untouched. Even the crows had not yet stirred from their inside. The cottage felt warm in a way it hadn't in days. Alice slept with the blanket drawn high, her face softened, no longer marked by fever or pain. Osric, curled in a chair by the fire, breathed deeply and evenly, his arms crossed over his chest. They looked for a moment like ordinary villagers at rest, not people standing on the edge of something vast and strange. You dressed in silence, layering wool and linen, strapping the map beneath your tunic and tying the small horn flask from Merelda at your waist. You placed the wooden token into the inside pocket of your cloak, where it throbbed faintly against your ribs, like a second heartbeat that didn't belong to you. At the door, you paused. There was no message to leave, no promise you could offer that wouldn't sound hollow. You simply looked at them once more, then stepped into the cold. Ashcombe was asleep. Chimneys puffed their morning smoke, sluggish and grey, drifting into the stillness. The snow muffled your footsteps, and each breath hung before you like a question you weren't ready to answer. You walked the path north again. Past the orchard, the collapsed fence, the well now nearly lost beneath a mound of frost. The trees greeted you in silence, leaning in close as you passed between them, their limbs heavy with snow, their roots still shifting quietly beneath the earth. The black tree stood where you left it, unchanged. The clearing around it remained warm, snowless. The spiraled stone ahead was no longer hidden. It stood like a sentinel in the mist, waiting. The air around it shimmered faintly, as though anticipating your return. You stepped forward and withdrew the token. At once, the air responded. The shimmer spread outward from the stone, the fabric of the world pulling open along an invisible seam. No flash of light, no thunder or music. Just stillness, then movement. The same fold you had seen before, now clearer. A doorway drawn not on wood or stone, but on the breath of the world itself. The path revealed itself. It was not what you expected. No gleaming corridor, no tunnel of light. Just a forest, different but not unrecognizable. Trees taller than any you had seen, leaves silvered with dew that did not reflect the sun. A trail carved not by foot but by memory. You crossed the threshold, the shimmer closed behind you. For a moment there was no sound, no birdsong, no wind, only the rhythm of your breath and the crunch of strange soil beneath your boots. You moved forward. The path bent gently, its curves subtle, natural. Every few paces a stone stood beside the trail, half sunken, each carved with a symbol, not spirals now, but unfamiliar glyphs, some smooth and soft, others jagged and sharp. The trees whispered, not with wind but with language, not words, emotions, echoes, regret, joy, longing, grief. And then you began to see them. Shadows. Not quite people, not quite shapes, impressions, like silhouettes burned into your vision after staring too long at a flame. They moved beside you, ahead of you, never turning to meet your gaze, always just beyond the reach of sound. One walked like a child, one moved as if wounded, one looked almost like you stopped. The shadow was yours, but older, worn, your stride slower, your shoulders curved. It moved with certainty, not toward you but away, always away. You followed. The trees began to change. No longer rooted in soil, they rose from black glass, their trunks translucent and hollow, filled with drifting specks of golden light. The path beneath your feet echoed now, as though each step reverberated not through earth, but through time itself. And then the air changed. It thickened, grew warm, electric. You reached a clearing, not natural, but made. The trees formed a perfect circle. In the centre stood a stone monolith, taller than a man, its surface carved in interlacing grooves, each glowing faintly as if remembering being touched. On the face of the stone was a symbol, not a spiral, not a glyph, a doorway, carved in perfect symmetry, its lines familiar in a way that sent something sharp through your chest. It was the shape burned into your thoughts when you dreamed, the one drawn into the margins of the map, the one you had never seen until you arrived, yet somehow had always known. You stepped forward. As you did, the space around you responded, not with noise, but with presence. The air folded inward. A hum rose from the stone, your vision blurred, not with light, but with motion. The shadows that had followed you coalesced at the edges of the clearing, forming a silent circle. Not men, not spirits, possibilities, reflections, and one stepped forward. It wore your face, but not the one you saw in the mirror each morning. This version bore a scar across the temple, eyes clouded with age. A cloak of dark green fell to its knees, and at its chest hung the same token you carried now, worn smooth by years of touch. You stared at it. It did not speak. It raised its hands slowly and pointed to the monolith. You followed the gesture. On the surface of the stone, the carving shimmered, then shifted, like pages of a book being turned by wind. Image house, but not the cottage. A room washed in yellow light. Books. Glass, a desk, a face in the reflection of a black screen, yours, your life before. And behind it, moments, not memories, but possibilities. You saw yourself stay in Ashcombe, you saw yourself swallowed by the forest, you saw yourself climb the hill at Barrowmere and never descend. You saw yourself walk this path again and again and again, each time a different choice, a different you. And then the images slowed, a final one remained, the same room, the desk, but empty. You turned back to the reflection of yourself, and it lowered its hand. You understood. The path did not choose, it simply showed. The choice was yours: return, change, or remain and forget. Go back to the world that dreamed you, or step forward and become something else entirely. And as the monolith pulsed once more beneath your hand, the clearing held its breath, waiting. The clearing held you in its stillness, not a pause of time, but a moment suspended, like the space between inhale and exhale, where all futures hovered just beyond the touch of breath. Around you, the reflections remained motionless. They did not blink, did not sway, each possibility rooted like a tree fixed in their silent roles. The air buzzed faintly, not with sound, but with potential. You stepped forward once more until your fingers brushed the surface of the monolith. The stone was cool, not cold. Its grooves vibrated beneath your skin, and where you touched it, the image froze, your old room, desk, the world you once knew. The memory wrapped around you like warm cloth, thick with familiarity, the feeling of electric lights humming softly, the taste of black coffee, the weight of keys in your palm, your name on a bill, the slant of the sun through dirty windows. You pulled your hand away. The image vanished. In its place, a new one surfaced. Ashcombe, snowfall over rooftops, Alis resting beside the hearth, Osric bent over a forge, Ellen kneeling at the frozen brook, her fingers trailing in the water. It was not your world, but it had somehow become yours. It had reshaped you, not in the grand dramatic way of tales, but in the quiet way life always does, with repetition, with care, with memory. Behind you, the reflection still stood, patient. It looked less like you now. The eyes were your shape, but not your colour. The lines at the mouth had formed differently. The weight in its shoulders was heavier, earned. It felt like a version of yourself who had long since made their choice and lived with it. You turned away from the monolith. "What happens if I stay?" you asked, not to the reflection, not to the clearing, but to the air around you, to the path, to what had drawn you here. The air answered in silence, but silence here was not emptiness. It was knowledge. You saw it, not in images, but in feeling. If you stayed, you would become a part of this place, not its prisoner, but not entirely yourself either. You would change. Your name would fade from memory. Your thoughts would quiet. You would take root in the story that had been waiting for you. No return, no clocks, no echoes of a world with screens and wires and neon-lit nights. Just Ashcombe. Forever. You turned back to the monolith. What if I go? This time the silence sharpened. A door reopened. You did not see it, but you felt it. The cold breeze of the life you left, the chaos, the clutter, the rush, the ache, and the unfinished, the words unsaid, the things not yet built, the people whose stories still entwined with yours, waiting in the corners of that other world. It would be harder, sharper, brighter, but it would be real. You stepped back. The reflections around the clearing did not move. Instead, they began to fade. One by one, like mist warming in the morning sun, they vanished until only one remained. Yours. Not older, not younger, not better. Just possible. It met your eyes once more and nodded. The monolith pulsed, a breath, a fold, and in the blink of a heartbeat, the clearing shuddered. The path beyond it began to unfurl, not forward, not deeper, but in reverse. A line rewinding through trees and shadows, leading you not to another future, but back. You stepped onto it. The world trembled softly beneath your feet, but held. The air, once thick with visions, now thinned with each step. The shimmer of time peeled away. The trees around you returned to their natural stillness. The strange glow of the leaves dimmed, and the soil lost its hum. You walked, and walked, and walked, until you found yourself once more at the spiral stone. The path behind you was gone. The black tree stood still, its branches unmoved. But the snow had returned. Fresh flakes fell softly, dancing through the cold air, and the clearing looked no different than the day before. No trace of footprints. No sign of the doorway. No sound, but the rustle of wind through naked branches. You looked down. The token in your hand had cracked cleanly in two. Its pieces lay warm in your palm for a heartbeat, then cooled. You closed your fist around them and turned back toward Ashcombe. The walk home felt longer. The village was waking as you arrived. Smoke trailed lazily into the morning air. A child laughed in the distance. Someone called for a dog. The sound of a hammer echoed from the smithy. Ordinary, ordinary, perfectly, achingly, wonderfully ordinary. Inside the cottage, Alis stirred. She looked at you as you entered, her gaze scanning you with a kind of knowing gentleness. You sat beside her, and for a long time neither of you spoke. Then, finally, she said, "You chose." You nodded. "Good," she whispered, eyes fluttering closed. And you realised, for the first time, you had made a choice not between then and now, not between here and home, but between forgetting and remembering, between fading and becoming. And as the snow fell gently beyond the windows, you placed the broken token on the mantel beside the box you had never opened, and let the fire warm you just as you were. Winter held Ashcombe in a gentle grip. Not harsh, not cruel, just firm like the hand of a mother keeping a child from wandering too far. Snow blanketed every rooftop and branch, softening the sharp lines of fences, smoothing the broken edges of stone walls. The days grew shorter, shrinking into soft-lit afternoons and long silver evenings. You remained. Each morning began the same, stoking the fire, steeping herbs for Alice, stepping out into the quiet cold to fetch water from the well. The rhythm of life returned, slower, steadier. People in the village began to nod when they passed you, not out of curiosity now, but familiarity. Trust, even. Osric came by more often. He brought news from the Northern Trail, game from his traps, and on occasion silence. He was comfortable in it. You were beginning to be as well. Alice recovered slowly. Her cough no longer rattled her chest like wind through bare trees, though she still moved with a wariness that spoke of years rather than illness. Yet something in her had changed, subtly. She no longer stirred at night, no longer mumbled names of forgotten saints in her sleep. Her dreams had quieted. She never asked again about the path, nor did you tell her more than what your eyes had already spoken. Instead, you helped her. There was much to do, potions to prepare, roots to dry, new tinctures to label, and people came, more than before. Farmers with stiff joints, children with winter fevers, a woman whose husband had not returned from the woods, though the snow held no sign of struggle, no broken trail. Alice handed you the bundles, gave you the instructions. She let you be the one they saw, the one they listened to. She was handing over the work, not out of need, but choice. You've learned the pace of the land, she told you one night, as you crushed pine resin over the hearthstone. Now you must learn its silence. You didn't ask what that meant. You were beginning to understand things without explanation. Ellen, too, had changed. She visited more often, her eyes brighter, her questions fewer. She brought little gifts, a carved wooden charm, a pouch of dried berries, once even a fragment of mirrored glass, smoothed at the edges. "This is for remembering," she said, as she placed it in your hand. And in the reflection you caught a glimpse of yourself. Rougher now, less out of place. The features were still yours, but softened by time, settled into the skin of this place. One morning, the reeve called a gathering in the square. The village stood in a rough ring, boots sinking into snow, cloaks pulled tight. He spoke of repairs for spring, of wolves near the river bend, of the need for an early blessing once the ground thawed. Then he gestured to you. "William," he said, using the name they had given you, "he will take the healer's place at the next turning of the moon." Alice said nothing. She only nodded once, almost imperceptibly. There was no applause, no ceremony. But afterward, as the villagers returned to their homes, more than a few touched your shoulder. One man handed you a worn leather pouch with buttons and nails. A woman left a folded scrap of wool near the cottage door. Quiet offerings. A way of saying, "We see you." You placed each token in a small wooden box near the hearth, not Alice's old box, but one Osric had carved from alder and gifted you without a word. That night, you could not sleep. You stepped out into the snow, the cold brushing your cheeks, the air filled with the quiet song of frost settling on stone. Above, the stars shone clearly for the first time in weeks, and you heard them, the bells, not loud, not near, but distant, threaded through the trees like threads of wind. You did not flinch. You walked to the edge of the orchard where the black branches tangled above the gate and stood beneath them, breath slow and visible. The bells continued, low and distant, as if calling not to you, but simply through you. You listened, and in that stillness, in that breathless dark, you felt no fear. You felt recognition. The path would always be there, not open, but waiting, not demanding, but remembering. You had chosen, and the world had accepted that choice. You returned to the cottage before the cold could seep into your bones. Inside, Alice sat near the fire, not asleep as you'd thought. "You heard them," she said. You nodded. "They're quieter now," she added. "They're still watching," you said. She turned her gaze to the flames. "That's their nature." You sat beside her in silence. The fire crackled, sparks drifting upward like thoughts left unspoken. Eventually she reached for your hand. "They've marked you," she said, "but you've marked them back." And with those words you felt a kind of peace settle into you, not as a weight, but as a rhythm. The steady beat of footsteps along a path now chosen, the gentle knowledge that you belonged not to one world, but within it, wherever its roots had grown. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere beyond the trees, the veil rested. For now, spring arrived in Ashcombe, not with sudden warmth, but with a quiet loosening. Snow melted slowly into the thirsty earth, pooling along paths and dripping from the eaves of every cottage. The trees, once skeletal and mute, began to whisper again. Buds formed along black branches. Birds returned, not all at once, but in scattered song, hesitant, as though asking permission to begin anew. The village stirred with it. Fences were mended, seeds planted. Thatched roofs were inspected for winter damage, and the forge rang again with more urgency than rhythm. You felt it in your own body too, a lightness returning to your chest, a readiness in your hands. Alice no longer needed you to tend the fire before dawn. Now she stayed in bed longer, wrapped in blankets not from weariness but from comfort. Her eyes followed you with a kind of settled trust. She no longer gave you tasks. She waited for you to choose them. One morning, without comment, she left her wooden box, the one she had always guarded so closely, atop your cot. When you opened it, the folded parchment map was gone. In its place were bundles of dried herbs, a sliver of black stone, and a slip of old vellum with a name written in ink now faded to rust.
Callan!
You held the name in your mouth for a long time before speaking it aloud. It was not yours, and yet it felt like a thread woven through your ribs. A shadow of something once known. Later that week you visited the northern path again, not to seek the veil, not to follow the shimmer, but simply to walk. The forest was beginning to green again. Ferns unfurled beneath the undergrowth. The stream near the black tree flowed now, slow but certain. You passed the place where the spiral stone had stood, but it had sunk deeper into the earth, half covered now with moss and thyme. The black tree remained untouched by the season, its bark still dark, still silent. You placed your hand on it for a breath, then continued on your way. There were no bells, no shimmer, no door. And that was fine. On the eve of the spring festival, the village gathered in the square to raise the central pole, wrap it in ivy and cloth, light the torches and feast beneath a sky no longer burdened by snow. The reeve said a blessing in his steady voice. Children ran wild, smearing mud on their tunics and chasing each other through the shallow puddles. Ellen danced. You hadn't seen her laugh so freely before. She wore a wreath of early flowers on her head and moved with the kind of joy only youth allows without self-consciousness. At one point, she caught your gaze across the crowd and smiled. Not as a child, not as someone curious of your past, but as an equal. Someone who knew the forest and the quiet and the weight of not speaking certain truths aloud. Osric joined you near the edge of the celebration, a mug of something warm in his hand. "You belong here now," he said. You didn't answer, not because you disagreed, but because the words felt too small. "Even the trees think so," he added with a smirk, then turned to join the singing circle. When the fires burned low and the stars stretched high, you lingered in the square alone, watching the last of the embers float into the dark. It was then you noticed it. The air around you, not different, not strange, but familiar in a way that defied explanation. Not the sharp scent of spring soil or smoke, but something deeper, a memory. No, an echo. You turned slowly and saw the figure sitting by the old well. It was not cloaked in shadow or mist. It was a man, dressed simply. Boots muddy, cloak worn, hair threaded with grey. He looked up as you approached, and you saw your own eyes in his. He didn't speak, just nodded, the way one might nod at a version of a dream remembered only half upon waking. You sat beside him. Both of you looked out at the empty square at the last flickers of flame. "I stayed," you said. He smiled, "So did I." A pause. "Are you me?" you asked. "In some thread, perhaps? From the path?" He didn't answer. But you didn't need him to. You understood. The veil had not closed forever. It never truly did. It simply stepped back, waiting, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as a memory of choice. The figure stood. "You'll be needed when the next one comes through," he said. "They won't understand the quiet. You'll help them hear it." You nodded. He touched your shoulder once, warm, steady. Then he walked down the lane toward the orchard, his shape fading into the silver fog that had crept in with the hour. You sat until the sun began to rise. The village around you yawned into wakefulness, roosters crowing, dogs barking, shutters being unlatched. the world beginning its day, unaware of the echo that had passed through it. You rose and returned to the cottage. Alice was already awake, sipping tea by the window. She looked at you and said nothing, but you saw the knowing in her gaze. You sat beside her, and outside, the bells did not ring. But you knew one day they would.